This podcast is about the conquest of Mexico and the city right there, Tenochtitlan, the city of the Mexica. That's the city the Spanish took 2 years to defeat. And by defeating that city, which ruled over much of Mexico, the Spanish opened the doors to rule over this vast new territory that they had discovered. But the story of the conquest of Mexico begins back in Spain, in Extremadura, and this was a province that produced many conquistadors. It was a poor province, there was very little land available, and many people here had fought against the Moors earlier. Um, One of the men who sprung out of this environment was Hernan Cortez. Cortez didn't initially appear to lean towards the fighting world. He went to law school, actually, in his teens, the University of Salamanca. We don't know a lot about Cortez's time at the University of Salamanca. In fact, he never actually mentions that he went there. Other people do. Bernal Diaz, a man who fought with him and a man who later wrote a history of the conquest of Mexico, says that Cortez went there. Either way, in Cortez's letters to the king, he really shows a sense that he understands Spanish law. He's able to cite examples of old Spanish law. He also cites Greek philosophers. And so really, he learned this stuff somewhere, and it really makes sense that he would have went to law school. At some point in his late teens, though, Cortez decided that a career in law was not for him, and he decided to go to the New World. So in 1504, Cortez set sail from Extremadura and headed for Hispaniola. When Cortez arrived in Hispaniola, he worked there for several years as a notary, and it's likely that his experience in law school led him to a job like this. But after several years, in 1511, Cortez and a man named Diego Velázquez, as well as others, headed for Cuba. And Diego Velázquez was leading the conquest of Cuba, and Cortez went as his personal secretary. And this job really allowed Cortez to kind of gain some power on the island of Cuba after they were able to defeat the indigenous people there. So Cortez ended up being mayor of Santiago de Cuba, which is in the eastern parts of the island, and doing pretty well for himself there. In Cuba, Cortez had an encomienda. This was actually really the goal of many Spanish conquistadors and explorers in the New World. An encomienda was a grant of native land and the labor of the people who lived on that land. You could essentially have them do anything, grow crops for you, mine gold, and mining gold is exactly what Cortez had the people on his encomienda doing. When a man named Pedro de Alvarado returned from an expedition to explore the mainland, Cortez lost interest with his encomienda and sought the rights to go explore further beyond what the Alvarado expedition had found. While Cuba's governor and Cortez's friend, Diego Velázquez, at first granted Cortez permission to go to Mexico, he rescinded that permission at the last moment. And so Cortez technically was never legally entitled to go explore Mexico. He left despite that, though. So Cortez left Cuba for Mexico as a fugitive. So in February of 1519, Cortez and roughly 600 men sailed for Cozumel, Mexico. They had 16 horses, 13 cannons, and about 14 muskets. And with this, they really stepped into the unknown. And one stroke of luck that they found in Cozumel was Geronimo Aguilar. And Aguilar had been shipwrecked 7 or 8 years prior to this and had lived with the Maya for this time. So he was able to serve as a translator for Cortez and his men for the first stages of their voyage, which really led them around the peninsula of the Yucatan. So the Spanish began to sail around the Yucatan Peninsula. Don't mind the straight line on this map here. They definitely sailed around it, and they eventually ended up in the Tabasco region. And here, Cortez found, you could say, the second key to the conquest. And this key was more important than Aguilar. This was Malintzin. And she was Cortez's most important translator from this point onwards. She played a critical role in negotiations at each and every stop they made along the way. From the Tabasco region, Cortez and his men made their way north, and eventually they reached a spot where they intended to head inland, and Cortez founded a city here, the city of Veracruz. And Cortez left about 150 men behind here. But one thing that he did before he moved inland is he scuttled his ships, and this essentially made them unusable. His men could not leave. And so essentially, they were faced with two choices: to sit around on the coast and wait for help, or join Cortez and go for this large conquest, the conquest of this city that was still unknown, but from what they had heard was magnificent. So Cortez and his men moved inland, and the first city at which they stopped was Campoala. And here, Cortez put on a military display of sorts. He set up a cannon in front of a tree, ordered one of his men to fire the cannon, and essentially disintegrated the tree in front of these indigenous leaders who were watching. And they made a quick choice to join Cortez and give him several hundred troops. The other reason that they were so willing to give Cortez troops was because he told them where he was going. He was going to see Montezuma, the king of Tenochtitlan, the Mexica, the people who ruled over the Aztec Empire. And from what Cortez heard, these guys were not great rulers. People did not like living under their rule. And so, in hopes that Cortez might free them from Aztec rule, from the Aztec Empire, they gave these soldiers, despite the fact that they didn't really know what Cortez's endgame yet was. So from here on, Cortez moved further inland from Campoala to Tlaxcala. And at Tlaxcala, he did battle with the Tlaxcalans for several days before they too realized that Cortez was going to see one of their enemies, Montezuma. And so they too gave Cortez troops. In this case, though, they gave several thousand troops. So, as Cortez moved through the countryside, as he moved in from Veracruz, he really increased the size of his army at almost every stop. Anywhere that Cortez stopped that was ruled by Tenochtitlan, that was ruled by the Mexica, those people were almost completely willing to give troops for his cause. They weren't necessarily thinking of the long-term possibilities. They were thinking of getting rid of their enemy, an enemy that they had known for decades. And here you had a foreigner with a furry face, unlike anything they had ever seen, willing to kind of help their cause. And so they gave troops to that cause.